Okay. Welcome everyone to our lecture video this week. This is week 4. We are looking at chapter 5 of the text 1. Excuse me. And this is all talking about facilities for corrections. So, correctional facilities, and it's just important to note that there are 3 types of facilities, or rather, 3 levels of facilities, because there's multiple types, and we'll talk about that as we go through. But really, our 3 major breakdowns are federal, state, and local. And if you have taken Intro to Criminal Justice or uh, just happen to know how the criminal justice system in general works, you're already aware that because we are a dual federalist nation, the United States, that means that we have the federal court system and the individual state system. So that you already knew there were going to be 2 different types. And then obviously there are differences between state and local. And so we're going to talk about all 3 of those today. That's the main point of this. And so without any further ado, let's just jump into it. So, right off the bat, we're going to talk about federal corrections, obviously, first. And really, federal corrections are any kind of correctional institutions that are at the highest level. We're talking those who go through the federal court system and are found guilty, they go to a federal facility in general. And so, obviously, this is the highest level of prison if you're trying to understand the hierarchy. Just like the federal laws are the highest level, this would be the highest level of corrections. Not that it controls everything that anyone ever says, but it does have that higher level. It's has more authority, and as we will talk about, it has some of the most dangerous and most violent criminals in their system. So, when we talk about federal corrections, we would be remiss to not talk about the Federal Bureau of Prisons. 1930, this was the Federal Bureau of Prisons was established, and the whole point of establishing this group was that trying to not unionize, wrong word, trying to make everything the same. Why am I drawing a blank on that word? Anyway, as I think of it, I'm going to be upset. But the idea was that across the board, all systems should follow a similar model. Up until this point, really, it was kind of, I jokingly say, the Wild West. But really, what I'm saying is that institutions could pretty much do whatever they wanted with their population. There wasn't really general guidelines. It was everyone agreed, at least on the most part, that if you're incarcerated, that you're locked away, and then whatever else they wanted to do, that kind of led to more stuff. And so here, when they established the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the idea was that if we get everyone to at least agree on some things, no matter where you are in the United States, you are treated somewhat fairly in a similar manner. And so the idea was to be more progressive and humane with the care of inmates. So instead of basic borderline torture, we're talking like, actually given a bathroom, place to sleep, things like that. Um, Also to professionalize the prison service. So it wasn't just, you can do whatever, but you actually have, career path within this. Because as we're going to talk about historically, prisons and jails themselves were not necessarily big institutions. So professionalize the prison service so that there was a hierarchy, there were rules to be followed, there were ways to do things, and that kind of stuff. And then, really, the last thing with establishing this Federal Bureau of Prison was to ensure consistent and centralized administration of the federal prisons. So, in 1930, there were 11 federal prisons. So, kind of, it was important that all 11 at least had a central office, a central place where they all were following the same rules, the same format, the same current theories of punishment, that kind of thing. So making it consistent, which is the word I was thinking of earlier, consistent, and then make sure that there's one point that they can go to. And so, again, at the time of creation, there were 11 federal prisons. As of 2015, which is when this part of the textbook was written, as of 2015, there were 121 federal prisons, 6 regional offices, 1 central office, 26 offices for residential reentry centers. And that is what the Federal Bureau of Prisons oversees. It oversees all the federal prisons, the regional offices, which, again, if you've taken Intro to Criminal Justice and potentially criminal law, you'll know that the United States itself, the different areas of the country, not necessarily the states, but there are regions. So there would be regional offices that would deal with particular groups and areas and deal with that kind of rules and would go back to that one central office. And then obviously 26 offices for residential reentry centers. Obviously, one of the big things about corrections that we've talked about since day one is really the goal is for an individual to be rehabilitated and re-enter into society as a full functioning member of society. So there are re-entry centers for both the federal system, the state system, and the local system. So the federal system, there's 26 offices, again, at the time of 2015, where they were designed to help those of that area kind of go back out into society. And so just real briefly, regional offices and central office, their whole goal and point of existence is to provide oversight and administrative support to institutions and offices. So again, central office is the big one, that's the main one, but there's the 6 regional offices that are in their particular areas. And the whole point is that if there's an issue, if there's a change, if there's a need for new policy, they go through there. They go through their regional office, and that goes through the central office. And if you're like, that sounds a lot like bureaucracy, welcome to government work. A lot of it is bureaucracy. And this is just a way to make sure, number one, that institutions are safe from potential legal recourse. It's to make sure individuals are safe from legal recourse. And it's to make sure that everything is done correctly. So it's important to note that there is a hierarchy within the correctional system. And then, as I've said, the Bureau, we're talking the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the top level, the above the central office, which, I mean, the central office is just like where it's located, but the idea of the Bureau is they're responsible for the care and custody of more than 208,000 federal inmates. Because remember, federal prisons, we're not talking about state prisons, we're not talking about local jails, we're talking about federal prisons. The Bureau is responsible for the care and custody of all the inmates in federal correctional facilities. So if something happens to them, they're responsible. And again, this is why we have these rules in place, why we have this bureaucratic chain of command. It's why things are done in particular certain ways, is to make sure that all of this stuff is done in the correct, appropriate, and best fulfilling way using evidence-based practices. So, just to continue on with federal corrections a little bit. So, as I kind of said, and this is important, the facilities, this is not just federal facilities, but in our textbook it talks under the federal corrections facilities, but I want to emphasize it's across the board. But these facilities are meant to be safe, humane, cost-efficient, and appropriately secure. That's the very first thing. Across the board, whether it's a local jail, a state prison, a federal prison, doesn't matter what it is. Its goals, their facilities should be safe, humane, cost-efficient, and appropriately secure. And we'll talk about levels of security here in a minute, but it's important to note that those are the key things of correctional facilities. We're talking even probation, parole. We're talking all of these potential situations, halfway houses, re-entry areas. All these things are meant to be safe, humane, cost efficient, and appropriately secure. This is where things differ between jails and prisons, and we'll talk about it later when we talk about local jails. But the other goal of, in particular, federal and state correctional facilities is to provide inmates with programs and services to assist them in becoming proactive, law abiding citizens on release. Because remember, the point of corrections, at least in current philosophical belief, is rehabilitation, have them released back into society as full functioning members. So they should have services that are geared and designed to help them become that upon release. And so, as I said, these is where we talk about the different types. So at the federal level, we have federal correctional institutions and detention centers. These are the big name prisons and things like that at the federal level I'm sure you're familiar with. But we also have to talk about privately managed and community-based facilities. So community-based facilities is obviously we're talking closer to the halfway house idea, but we've talked about this before. There's a big push for community-based corrections, community-based work. And the idea is that it does reduce the overhead cost for the government, but it also involves the community with the development and the rehabilitation of an individual. It helps the community as a whole grow from the experience and heal. So community-based facilities are very important. I'm not going to belittle that at all. We've talked about that, but we're going to talk about privately managed facilities specifically as we start to get into state facilities, because there's something that's important to mention about these privately managed facilities, and that is in particular that they are not run by the government. They are run by either private citizens or private corporations, and there's a big asterisk that we need to talk about that. But anyway, you'll see the last thing that says local jails, and I have an asterisk there too. And your brain, you should be going, wait a second, Mr. Wheaton, you just said that federal correction facilities are like federal prisons, and local jails are not federal. So what does that mean? And I'm glad you are asking that. And if you're not asking that, shame on you. No, I'm kidding. So specifically, local jails are can be part of the federal correctional facility program. In particular, it's when they're under a contract with the Federal Bureau of Corrections. The idea is that they really only use local jails as kind of a way station when they're waiting to transport an inmate from one facility to another, awaiting or finishing trial and awaiting to actually be placed in a facility. Local jails are used by the federal system. The difference is that they use those local jails as more of a way station. It's not like it's a permanent placement. You wouldn't find a federal prisoner being held in a jail indefinitely till the end of time. No, they would be there until a proper transport and space at a facility opened up, and then they would be moved there. So it's a little weird. We'll talk more about it when we talk about local jails, but it's important just to note here that we will talk more about it when we get there. So, as I said, we have different levels of prisons, and we see them, we're usually based on, well, not usually, they are typically known by their security levels, and I'm sure you've heard of some of these terms before. These are for, obviously, federal prisons, but there are also similar terms for the state prison system. The state prison system follows pretty much the same thing as the federal system. The difference is there's some wiggle room, and we'll talk about that when we get into the state stuff. But obviously, from lowest to highest at the federal level, there are four main breakdowns. There's minimum security, there's low security, there's medium security, and there's high security. And really, what they mean by the levels of security is it comes down to pretty much prisoner mobility and the kind of security features that the prison has access to. Almost all of them, if not all of them, will have some kind of video surveillance and some kind of fencing around the facility and locking mechanisms. That's the bare minimum. So that would be like a minimum security level prison would have just that. And as you go higher, you get more pieces. And we'll talk about prisoner mobility in just a second. But if you notice, I said 4 and there are 5 here. And we have a 5th category, but notice there's an asterisk next to that. Maximum security. This is the term that most people have heard in parentheses. And that's a supermax. There are supermax prisons, and why I say state prisons are similar. There are supermax state prisons, and there is only one supermax federal prison. And that's the important note and why I have the little asterisk there. At the federal level, there's only one maximum security prison, and that facility has the least prisoner mobility and houses the most violent criminals that have been through the court system, as well as those who have the highest potential for a flight risk in particular. And so what this comes down to, if you remember, I said we'll talk briefly about prisoner mobility. Our textbook itself has a drawing, a depiction in the federal chapter of what a supermax cell, or rather 2 cells in a pod, look like. There is very little room to move. It is straightforward. The idea of prisoner mobility, especially in a supermax prison, is that they are not going anywhere. The less amount of movement that a prisoner has, the less likely they are to escape, cause violence, any of the above things. So it's pretty much, if you think about the history of penitentiaries, it's pretty close to a traditional penitentiary. You're in your room 99.9% of the time. You're not really getting a chance to move. And so obviously, as you go down in those levels, so even at the high security facilities, there's little mobility, but prisoners will still likely be able to, interact with others. They might do labor within the prison itself. Medium security and low security tend to have the work release kind of programs where prisoners will work with an outside facility, usually doing labor and whatnot, and they will be transported by the prison and return and all that stuff. So typically that's at the low and medium level. The high level, they tend not to leave the facility, and supermax, they are not going anywhere. And so that is the very basic breakdown of the different security levels of the federal and, to an extent, the state prison system. Overall, no matter what it is, the design of these facilities is to operate with common goals and to serve inmates appropriately. So typically, someone who commits a petty crime is not going to be put into a supermax prison. That would not be appropriate to their crime and the goal of rehabilitating. It just wouldn't make sense. So they'd probably be put in low to minimum security. But someone who has committed mass murder and killed dozens of people, it's highly likely they're going to be put in a minimum security federal prison. They're probably putting them in a high to a supermax, depending. So that's important to at least understand. But when we talk about different levels of prisons, while the primary function that people understand and why they're classified the way they are is because of security. It's not just security. The medical services that are available also kind of scale with the level of security. So obviously at a minimum security facility, their medical services are probably going to be not as high, partly because those criminals are not as much of a flight risk or as a violent threat, so they probably would have outside medical services, whereas a supermax will probably have infirmary and some kind of medical staff within the facility to oversee all of these things, and they would only be released under a very extreme situation. So, yeah, the medical services that are available scale with the security level. The lower it is, the less it needs to be, whereas the higher it is, the more service that needs to be available. That kind of idea. And so, as we've kind of talked about, and you'll notice that both the chapter and the notes in this lecture, we talk a lot about the federal and we talk a lot about the local. And when we get to the state, I'll explain why. But so for the federal corrections ideas, there's basic philosophy of how they operate and why they operate. And it comes down to really, and this is probably the most noble idea, and I think that this is the model that really, when the everyday person talks about sending people to prison, this should be understood by them as well, so that they really understand how the system works. It's not just meant to be a punishment. So the general philosophy of federal corrections is that preparation for reentry into society begins on the first day of incarceration. You don't get one day to kind of figure things out. It is from the moment you step foot into this facility, you are working towards reentry. And so, what that looks like varies depending on what the individual inmate needs. And so, because of that, this is accomplished by having several options available to inmates depending on the needs. That's why we have, as I mentioned before, the different levels of not just security, but medical services, things like that. Individuals, when they are sentenced to a time in a facility, these are the kinds of things that they look for and see where do they need to go. So some individuals might have substance abuse, so they might need substance abuse treatment. Some might need mental health treatment. Maybe the pathway to this, and a lot of facilities will do this, is offer education, getting a GED, or even labor training, skills training, things like that. Religious services, not everyone is religious, but not everyone is not religious. And sometimes, and it's important, we've talked about this in Intro to Criminal Justice and we talk about it in criminal law. Surprisingly, for some people, prisoners and inmates, whatever term you want to use, inmates do still have most of their constitutional rights. They still have the freedom of religion. They have the right to practice. And with that being said, that means that they offer religious services. They might have religious clergy or higher members of a particular religious order maybe come in and do services. They try to accommodate inmates to make sure that their religious rights aren't being infringed on. Sometimes that means that a religious individual might end up being a pseudo mentor system to kind of help individuals. So that's a thing that needs to be noted. Maybe anger management treatment is really the core issue of an inmate, and so offering anger management services is important. Parenting support as a general overarching thing, because again, the point of incarceration in our current theory of quote unquote punishment, in our theory of punishment, it's rehabilitation. The goal is not to never let you have anything and to lock you away. The goal is to fix what's wrong so that you can be a full functioning member. So parenting support might be an important piece for some people, and it's not like they're trying to prevent you from seeing your family, they're trying to help you be better. uh, Work assignments, as we said before, as the lower levels of security are needed, work assignments offer, training, uh, labor work, could potentially be the first real job an individual has, could be training for an actual job outside of prison. Like, work assignments are really helpful. There's a terrible old adage that goes, "The devil's idle hands are the devil's plaything." The just general concept outside of the religious implications is that people that aren't doing anything are more likely to do something wrong, do something quote unquote evil or bad. So, working, it's a good way to keep yourself busy. There are programs for pro social values, so how to be a functioning member of society, not just be an antisocial individual who is at a higher risk of committing crime, that kind of thing. And then at the federal level, they have release preparation programs across the board. And the idea is that in the later part of their sentencing, the idea is that you are getting ready for release back into the world. And it's a chance to get a better idea of how the world reacts to this, how you fit in, how to navigate the system. And I don't mean that as in like how to get away with things. I mean that as in how to accept where you are and move throughout society. They're important skills. And so again, re-entry into society begins the first day of incarceration. If an individual is incarcerated and they need certain help, that's going to start right away. If it doesn't, then we need to figure out what actually is the problem. All right. So, getting into the state level corrections now, it's a very similar structure and general structure and theories of support and all that other stuff as the federal level. The biggest difference is that it's for less serious offenders. So we still have supermax prisons at the state level, um, Alcatraz, the big, scary places. But really, what I'm trying to hopefully get at for you in considering what a supermax is um, at the state level, they're places for the most violent and most escape prone individuals of the state courts, not of the federal courts. Again, much like at the federal level, there's not a lot of inmate mobility. I gave the example of Alcatraz, that comes from our textbook, but if you're a super nerd like me and you like comic books, I can't think of what the DC one is, but Marvel's The Raft, where they put all the supervillains in the middle of the ocean in an underwater facility. Yeah, same concept. You're not really allowed to move much of anywhere. But after Supermax, we really have medium security and minimum security. There's really only three levels of security when we consider state corrections. Supermax being the most, medium security being typically what is most of them, where it's just, there is prisoner mobility. It's for offenders who are not as serious, but they do still have a lot of security features in place, but they offer more mobility for prisoners. Excuse me. So, really, it's a chance for a lot of these programs to operate so that prisoners can, get work release, things of that nature. Minimum security at the state level is almost exclusively nonviolent offenders. The goal is that, violent individuals not really that big of a threat, so they can be put in a minimum security facility where there's not the need for extra security. Not to say that there isn't a need for security. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit. But this is where we get into couple things that are different from the federal level that I want to talk about. And one of them is women's prisons. So, obviously, uh, immediately your brain hopefully should be going, wait, what do you mean women's prisons? So, not all facilities are co ed, not all of them are gender neutral. They tend to be broken down by gender. So there's women's prisons and men's prisons. Uh, Part of this comes down to there's a lot of theories and fear of sexual violence in co ed prisons and things of that nature. And so a lot of facilities don't want to deal with that. So they typically have separations for that. The data is not perfect on that. There's definitely data that shows that, yeah, when you have men and women together in the same facility, you have potentially increased rates of sexual assault, but you also have increased sexual assault in same sex prisons. So, does it really solve the problem? No. It's super complicated, and but really what I want to focus on instead of that issue is, if you remember, back a week ago, 2 weeks ago, if you've taken some of the other criminal justice classes, we've talked about the different types of inmates, the different types of individuals. And it's important to note that different factors play different roles. And so, women inmates, female inmates are typically, and I say that with a big asterisk, typically nonviolent drug offenses. That drug offenses, prostitution, um, these are the crimes that they're usually in for, not for murder, assault, things of that nature. Doesn't mean they can't, but statistically speaking, they are not most likely committing those crimes. Um, but another reason for why we might have a women's prison versus a men's prison comes back to, if you remember when we said at the federal level, it's not just security level, it's medical services offered. Women have different medical needs than men. For one thing, women can get pregnant. So, what do? You're going to have certain medical services available for individuals who are pregnant, or you're going to have to be able to let people in who are medical professionals to help with this. And there's also issues of whether or not it's safe and compliant for a pregnant individual. There is a lot of additional issues when considering just pregnancy. That's not acknowledging any other medical, scientific, biological differences between women and men. That is part of the reason why we see this separation, that women typically are in a separate facility. There's also issues of gender of guard, but that's a super high level discussion and more of a philosophy and psychology discussion rather than criminal justice. So we're not going to really get into that, but it is just important to note that there is this distinction. The other big one that I absolutely love to talk about, especially with the state level, is private prisons. And private prisons are just that. They are not run by the state, they're not run by the federal government. These are private corporations or citizens. And it all came about because they had this basic argument that, we can run a prison better and cheaper. And essentially, the federal and state government said, okay, bet, do it. And the data shows that not really work. Pretty much any private prison, any corporation that said that they could run a prison more cost effective and more effective in general, pretty much found that they were wrong. They didn't realize how expensive it was. There was a lot of liability for safety, security, staffing, a host of potential legal issues. Like, it was more than they anticipated. So the data shows that didn't really work, at least not in the deliverables that they promised to run it more efficiently and better. If anything, they did about the same or slightly worse. So it's important to note that there aren't a whole lot of big private prisons anymore, but there was a boom in the 2000s of this, late 90s, early 2000s. They're still out there, but again, it's just important to note. All right. So, in case you can't tell, now we're going on to the local level, and we're going to be talking about jails. But just as a quick reminder, the reason the state we didn't get too in depth about all of them is simply because they follow a very similar structure as federal. If we talked about federal, talking about all that again at the state level would just be repeating. So, just keep that in mind. All right. So, the local level corrections. Obviously, there are a lot of community corrections that we've talked about already before, but really to help us understand the difference between a prison and a jail, we need to talk about the different levels. So prisons are the state level and the federal level. Jails are the local levels. And so really just this is a random fun fact. It might appear on a quiz or on an exam or maybe even a bonus point. I don't know. But fun fact, U.S. jails, the whole concept originates in feudal England and the Gaol, Gaols. These were just jails. They spell things weird because it's feudal medieval England. But really, these feudal English jails were where the sheriff would oversee a small holding facility that really just held an individual until they were put to trial. So they weren't designed to rehabilitate, they weren't designed to do anything but hold an accused individual until they went to trial. So think the old school Wild Wild West jail cell where the sheriff comes and arrests you, and there's two rooms that have bars and a bed, and pretty much the person just is stuck in there until something else happens. That's the idea. They would have been way darker, stone, and not humane at all because that was a different time. But that is the basic understanding of what a feudal English jail looked like. Actually, if you want a really probably good example of what it would have resembled, Disney's animated Robin Hood or any of the old school English type things will show you fairly well what a jail would look like. But jails themselves, again, they started as this facility just to hold individuals who were awaiting trial. As the penitentiary movement began, they evolved to follow that kind of model. So now, instead of just holding someone awaiting trial, now you held someone who was accused and who was on trial, and now you're holding them in these small, dark cells with the goal of reforming them and helping them come to terms with the terrible things they've done and to move on. Then, as laws changed and we essentially made it illegal to be mentally ill or a vagrant, jails ended up being a place where the mentally ill were dropped and people who were homeless were put into jails. As we closed actual mental facilities that were designed, the institutions that led to this. And then now, here we are. It went through several different things, but now jails are secure detention facilities that are really designed to be there at various points during the process. They are not just meant to hold a person awaiting trial, and they're not just meant to hold someone after trial. They are there for all throughout the process. Whenever it needs, it's there. It's a secure detention facility, a secure facility to hold an individual at any point during the process. And because it's there for any part, it means it's not just local. It's not just a local concern. What it is it works with several law enforcement agencies, the federal government, military, state troopers, local PDs, other local PDs that are not within jurisdiction. It is meant to work cooperatively with the overall law enforcement agencies to offer a potential detention facility during the process. And because of this, because it works with several different agencies, and because it's available for any point during the process, this means that they serve probably the most diverse populations across the board. They don't just have the most terrible violent criminals, and they don't have, the person who ran a red light and didn't pay their ticket and now they're there. No, they have the whole gamut. They have the mentally ill, they have vagrants, they have prostitutes, they have, pick your poison, they potentially have it. So in understanding jails, there are two primary functions of a jail. It's intake and custody. And so intake, also known as booking, is simply providing a secure environment in which potentially dangerous persons can be assessed. So if you come back to the point that we made earlier about individuals who are waiting to go into the federal system, if you remember, I said jails are part of that. This is what that's for. Intake and booking. It's a secure place where an individual is waiting and they can be assessed to find out what needs they actually need. They need mental help. Well, then we'll make sure that it goes to a facility that has a lot of mental health care. If it's an individual who is an extremely high flight risk and very violent, we will make sure that they go to a Supermax. If they are an individual who has this, that, and the other, we'll make sure. The idea is that the first point, that intake, is to understand where those temporary holdings, where they're going to be going next, to find that part. The other part of a jail function, the custody part, this is where people are deprived of their liberty for the purposes of pretrial detention and punishment. What does that mean? We're going to dig into that now. So, this is all under custody. Pretrial detention is very basic, and that is just the idea that an accused person who is pending arraignment is held awaiting trial, conviction, or sentencing. The idea is that if the person is potentially a flight risk or they might not show in court, the idea is, okay, we're going to hold them in jail while they await their trial, they await their conviction hearing, or they await their sentencing hearing. The idea is that because it can't be trusted that they're not going to run, they are held in jail. This is where we get the concept of bond that we talk about in Intro to Criminal Justice. Bond is where you are held in jail, or you have a monetary fine that if you pay, it's your guarantee you will appear in court. Pretrial detention is the physical side of the monetary piece. So typically, and this is where things get a little scary, more than half of inmates that are in jails are awaiting trial. And part of that is because the average time between an arrest and sentencing is 6 months. So because it takes so long for a case to proceed and for an individual to get placed in an actual facility, a lot of people who are in jails are just awaiting their trial and their sentencing. They're waiting to get placed in their quote-unquote permanent facility until they're released. Another role that jails offer as far as pretrial detention, or rather detention in general, is that they readmit probation and parole violators and absconders, people that are breaking their probation or parole, that typically the condition of it is that you return to prison. if you're on parole and you were in the federal or state prison system, likelihood of you going back to prison is lower. You're probably going to go to a jail, uh, essentially to quote unquote not really punish, but try to figure this stuff out until things are figured out, whether you get released back and your parole is not taken away or whatever it may be. So the goal is not to punish, but to protect the public and ensure you appear in court. Go figure. Um, so, as we kind of said earlier, jails are primarily a local concern. They're run by local groups, local municipalities, local uh, police states. Despite the fact that it's changed a lot since the uh, old feudal English style, still typically the sheriff is the person who is in charge of administration for jails. They're the ones that make the decisions, so it still is that structure. Um, but really, the whole point of a jail is it's a short-term holding facility. It is not meant to hold individuals there for life, not meant to hold people there for 30 years for a punishment. No, they're meant to hold people usually less than a year, maybe a little bit more, but the idea is that it's a short term holding facility. And so the other side to that, it's not just pretrial detention, it is also punishment. And that's where we said that less than 1 year sentence. So obvious housing for misdemeanor offenses, if just a reminder, there's a difference between misdemeanor and felony. If you took intro to criminal justice, if you took criminal law, if you took juvenile justice, if you took basically any criminal justice class, we use the terms misdemeanor and felony. You should know these words by now, but if not, misdemeanors are lesser offenses that are not as serious, and they tend to be followed up with fines and typically a time served in a jail facility. Whereas a felony is a more serious crime, typically has a greater impact, and while there may be fines or restitution, typically you will spend an extended period within a prison. So, as far as the punishment for a jail is concerned, it's really housing for misdemeanor offenses. So, we're talking 1 year and less sentences. And the primary goal is deterrence, both for incarcerated and those who have not committed a crime yet. Um, Going back to our theories of punishment, deterrence is trying to prevent further or or preventing any potential crime from being committed. The goal of the punishment of jail is just deterrence. And part of that is because the size of the facility, the funding, the staff available, jails are not large facilities with lots of money to go into it. They are meant to be smaller facilities. Not to say they're not big, but they're not meant to house thousands of prisoners at a time for long extended periods. They're smaller. Uh, but because of all this, they're not typically capable of offering rehabilitation or reintegration programs. They don't have the ability to offer these big programs that are meant to help an individual. So, really, the goal of a prison, or sorry, the goal of a jail is to say, yeah, you really don't want to do this crime. Don't do it. Whereas a prison, it's like, hey, don't do a crime, but we're going to help you so that you don't commit the crime again. You understand the deeper issues. It's a very basic breakdown, but again, it comes down to staffing, funding, size of facility. So, again, important to note, punishment is the secondary goal of the public, or not the public, the local jail. And as I keep alluding back to the federal level, obviously, at the federal level, they use the local jails for a lot of things. So this is where miscellaneous functions of a jail come in, transporting and transferring inmates to federal, state, or other authorities. I mentioned, jails are typically temporary situations. They're meant to just wait. They're meant to hold an individual until they're sent to their proper facility, holding mentally ill pending transfer to a proper facility, hold individuals that are wanted by the armed forces, so individuals who commit a crime or are currently being searched for by a branch of the military or some form of armed forces. Police will hold them in jail custody until the armed forces can get there, and usually some kind of MP or military police will take over then. Protective custody, the ever classic, if someone needs some kind of secure holding, protective custody is something that a jail can be used for. Hold individuals who are in contempt of court, or even hold witnesses for court trials. If they need to be in a secure facility where they're not going to be at risk of violence, they might be held in custody, not as a punishment, but rather as a protection point. And so, with understanding all of those different uses and reasons for using these facilities, that means that the populations are very different. So, with the wide range of potential inmates, there's a wide range of population needs. And again, that comes down to what facility do they get placed in when they are going to their permanent peace. So, the populations that are in a jail at any given time can range: substance abuse, alcohol abuse, mental illness, medical problems, psychological problems, emotional problems. You get the whole range. And so, obviously, this is the last slide, but what I'm hoping that you take away, if nothing else, from this is that the different levels of facilities tend to have different populations and services based off of the needs of the prisoners. Really, I know we already talked briefly about the inmate types, and this week we're talking about the types of facilities. But with those two combined, I'm hoping that there's a better understanding that there's not a one-size-fits-all inmate and there's not a one-size-fits-all facility. Depending on the individual needs will determine what facility an individual is sent to or sentenced to, because sometimes they're sentenced to a particular facility, but there might not be room at that facility, and so then we get this kind of temporary stay where it might be kind of situation. So, if nothing else you take away, please take away that there are a vast potential population and vast array of facilities that meet those individual needs within the corrections system. You're not just sent to a prison and that's it. If you are someone who actually needs help, you tend to be tried to sent to a facility that meets those needs. And that's what corrections should be. If we're going by the theory and model of rehabilitation, you're not just sent for punishment. You're sent to a place that can help you become the best you can be and release back into society. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for sitting through this lecture. My hope is that from this, if you are interested in corrections, you have a better idea that it's not just one type of person. And maybe after listening to this lecture, you thought of more questions potentially that you would want to ask someone in the corrections field. If you do, please feel free to email me those extra questions. I have not done the interview yet, so you have until I do that to give me questions, and I will gladly ask. But anyway, thank you very much. I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.